Hey everyone, Digital Scriptorium here, and today I want to show off how to install Kali Linux 2025 step by step from start to finish. This guide is intended as a general use case installation of the operating system. I'm going to show off system requirements, how to create the bootable media, installing the operating system, and then giving a general rundown of the operating system itself. I won't be going into specific application usage as that is outside of the scope of my guide today. All the links I show off I will include in the description below so you can easily find them if need be. One disclaimer I just want to mention is a warning that this is an operating system install guide where I completely remove the previous operating system off of the machine. As is with any operating system, you might run into unforeseen issues, so you have to go into this with an open mind that issues might spring up. Worst case, you can always attempt to install a different operating system back on. If you need help, I have many different Windows and Linux guides to accomplish this. Before I begin, I also want to mention that if you are feeling generous, to think about donating to support my channel on either Ko-Fi or Patreon. Every bit goes back into making new guides. Alright, with that all said, let's dive in. Alright, so right off the bat, let's talk about system requirements for Kali Linux. So one of the big things that it mentions in one section of the documentation is that basically as long as you have the system recommendations for Debian, then Kali Linux should work fine. So in that case, even though we're looking at the system requirements section here, ultimately what we're talking about is essentially a dual core or better processor, at least 2 gigs of RAM, although it starts to mention that 8 gigabytes or even more may be required for certain applications that you may kick off on it. Quite frankly, this day and age, 8 gigabytes of RAM shouldn't be a problem to hit as kind of a baseline. Worst case, if possible with your machine, you could always up the amount of memory. And then it mentions 20 gigs of disk space, which shouldn't be too difficult to reach these days. My recommendation is, if possible with your computer, that you have a solid-state drive in it just to make it extra peppy for performance, which again shouldn't be too difficult to achieve these days for hardware. One thing it also mentions is that in the UEFI settings of your BIOS, that secure boot needs to be disabled, and I'll go over that when we get to that point in the guide. So with this out of the way, let's go ahead and download Kali Linux. So going to Kali Linux's website, which I will have a link for in the description below. However, let's select this section that says Installer Images, and we'll click on this, and then I'm just going to scroll down just a tiny bit. There's going to be a number of options that you can select here. One thing just to mention is that there is the x86 and 64-bit platforms, and then there's the Apple Silicon ARM64. So if you have one of the M-based processors from Apple and you want to load Kali Linux on an Apple machine with an M-based processor, then you would just click this and then it would give you the options here. And then for x86 64-bit machines, then it has the default options that we saw earlier. My recommendation for the image to download is to select the recommended one they have. Now this is considered the complete offline installation with customizations. There is technically another option for offline installation, which is this one, which comes with everything. The noticeable difference between these two is that you're looking at a 12 gigabyte image file over a 4.1 gigabyte file. And the thing is that, this is literally going to have everything on it, whereas this has basically practically everything you're going to need anyhow. In worst case, you can always download more stuff if need be, as long as you have an internet connection to the machine. So for the sake of this video, we're going to download the recommended installer. So I'm just going to click on this, and then I will wait for this to finish downloading, and we will continue on. Alright, so the Kali Linux ISO image is now downloaded. Now the other piece to the puzzle is we are going to need a utility to get Kali Linux loaded onto a USB thumb drive to become bootable media. So what we're going to use is we're going to use a utility called Rufus. So once again, I will have a link for Rufus in the description below, but the nice thing with Rufus is that it is a very small standalone application that doesn't have to be installed at all. It literally is a self-contained executable file. So you don't have to install anything, you just download it, and kick it off. So if we scroll down to about midway on their page, then look for this section that mentions latest releases. There's going to be a number of options here. So there's the 64-bit standard version, there's the portable 64-bit, there's the standard x86 version, which is aka the 32-bit version, and then there's a Windows on ARM 64-bit version. Most users are going to most likely go with the Windows 64-bit version. I never use the portable version just because everything is in the standard version. So we're going to download this. If you get this pop-up, this is not the download. Click the X, and then it should be downloaded, and it's very, very tiny. As you can see here, it's only 1.5 megabytes in size, which is pretty impressive for such a powerful utility. We can go ahead and close out of the browser for now, as we don't need that anymore. And then I'm just going to go into my downloads folder. Now that I'm in the downloads folder, so once again, I've got Rufus and I've got the Kali Linux ISO in here. One thing I've noticed lately with Windows-based machines that have Windows Defender active on them is that Windows Defender has been getting very aggressive with its real-time protection and basically flagging a lot of things as false positive a lot with any Linux operating system, especially with Kali Linux, because it has all of its specialty applications on it that seem sketchy to Windows. So what we're going to do first, and this is critical if you are building this up on Windows 10 or Windows 11, is go to Start, and then let's just do a search. You can just start typing in security, and we'll click on Windows Security, and then select Virus and Threat Protection, and then under Virus and Threat Protection Settings, click on Manage Settings. And then we're just going to temporarily turn off real-time protection. And this is just going to make sure that we don't have Windows Defender pac-manning the files as they're trying to get onto the thumb drive. And I would recommend the same thing if you're planning to just burn it to a DVD or SD card or whatnot. So we're just going to click this, select yes for the UAC prompt. One thing to mention is that this is not outright turning real-time protection off forever. This is just a temporary thing. So if you were planning to have a Windows machine like I'm showing here, and you're not planning to nuke this machine, but you're planning to put Kali on a different machine, just don't worry about this. It will automatically turn back on in something like 20 minutes or something of that sort. Or if you reboot the machine, it will come back on automatically as well. So nothing to worry about on that front. So let's get back to the downloads folder or wherever you have Rufus and the Kali Linux ISO. Let's double click on Rufus. Select yes for the UAC prompt. And then at this point, I recommend plugging a thumb drive into your machine. In this case, I would recommend an 8 gigabyte or larger thumb drive. I will have a link in the description below for a recommended thumb drive in case you don't have one on hand and you're curious on one that should work no problem. So anyhow, plug your thumb drive in at this point, double click on Rufus, select yes for the UAC prompt. And then if all goes well, we should see that there is a thumb drive plugged into this machine. If you don't find your thumb drive, then I would recommend unplugging, plugging it back in. Sometimes you may even have to reboot your machine with it plugged in for it to detect it. So just a few troubleshooting steps there. So in this case, let's go ahead and click on Select, and then hunt down where your Kali Linux ISO was downloaded to. Click on Open. And then it's going to scan the image, and then generally it finds all kind of the recommended things that it needs in here. And so I leave everything as is. And then before you click on Start, if there is anything you need on the thumb drive for data, go ahead and back it up now, because when we click Start, then we are basically going to nuke the thumb drive entirely. We're going to clean slate it. And then we are going to load the Kali Linux image on it to make it a bootable media. So just an FYI. So we'll click on Start, and then I leave everything as is for the recommended options that Rufus recommends. Click on OK. It's going to say, are you really sure you want to destroy the data on your drive? Click on OK. Sometimes what might pop up is you may actually get a screen that says that there's also multiple partitions on the drive, and it's again just warning you that it's going to nuke all of the data. So that's perfectly fine. Just click OK for that, and then continue on with the process. Anyhow, at this point, it is currently writing all of the data to the thumb drive. So let's just be patient and I will continue on once that is complete. All right, if all went well, then we should see ready here, which means that everything went through successfully. If for some reason it errors out here, for one, just double check that the temporary suspension of the real-time protection didn't wear off. And also just double check that everything is happy with the thumb drive and that it wasn't loose or something of that sort. Worst case, also just reboot the machine, rinse and repeat the real-time protection being turned off, and then try it again. It may have just been a fluke. But anyhow, in this case, we are good to continue on. So I will click on close, and then I'm going to close out of this. So the next step of the process is going to be double checking the secure boot status of the machine. So as I had mentioned earlier, showing off the system requirements, it mentioned that secure boot has to be turned off in order for Kali Linux to boot and all that good stuff. So we are going to get into the BIOS of the machine and we're going to double check that setting. Now, unfortunately, every make and model can be different in how to access the BIOS. So for one, I recommend that you Google the key that you need to mash when the computer is starting up to get into the BIOS. The other thing to mention is that BIOSes can be very different across models. So generally speaking, secure boot is probably located in a section that's called security, and then just kind of keep looking. Worst case, just keep kind of tabbing through stuff until you can find secure boot. Anyhow, in my case, I am on a Lenovo desktop, so I'm just going to mash the enter key, which should give me the options on getting into the BIOS. So I'm going to plug the thumb drive into the machine that I'm going to install Kali Linux on, and then I'm going to fire that up and we'll go through the whole process. All right, I'm just waiting for it to come back up, and I'm just going to keep mashing the enter key for mine. However, like I said, mash whatever key is the one that is recommended for your make and model. In my case, I just have to hit the F1 key. And next up, I'm going to move over to the security section. I'm just going to use my arrow keys. Some BIOSes, you can use the mouse and all that good stuff. Anyhow, I can see secure boot is down here. So I'm just going to tab down and then I'm going to hit enter. And I do see that secure boot is turned off, but if for some reason it was enabled, then just hit enter or whatnot, and then just toggle it to disabled. So in my case, I'm just going to hit F10 to save and exit. But before I do so, this is the opportunity that we need to now get it to boot off of a thumb drive. So again, I would recommend you Google the exact make and model of your machine to figure out what key you need to mash to get it to give you the boot options so that you can select the thumb drive. So I'm just going to hit F10 to save and exit. And we'll hit enter for yes, and then I'm going to start mashing the F12 key because at least for mine, that's what the boot selection key is. So in my case, I have the USB HDD or hard disk drive. It may show up as USB hard disk drive. It may show up as USB thumb drive. It may even show up as USB virtual CD or DVD drive. But as long as you can kind of see the manufacturer of the thumb drive, in my case, mine's a Samsung. So this looks great. So I'm just going to hit enter, and then I'm going to be patient as it now starts to pull the data from the thumb drive. There's a number of options here. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to hit enter for the graphical install, and then just be patient as everything loads up. So the first setup screen we're going to be shown is the select a language screen. So I'm going to leave it as English, but of course you can feel free to change it to whatever language is best for you. We'll click on continue, and then it's going to ask you to select your location. Once again, select your location here. United States is fine for me. I'm going to click continue, and then it's going to ask you to configure your keyboard. Once again, select what your keyboard language is, and then click on continue, and we'll wait for it to detect stuff here. It should go through several screens as it's loading things and scanning stuff. Now it's checking to see if there is internet connectivity. In my case, I have a hardwired connection that is live. However, if you only have wireless, it does give you the option to select wireless, and then you can go through the process of getting it to connect to your wireless to continue on. But anyhow, my recommendation is always, if you can, and if physically possible, plug in an Ethernet cable as that's going to be the best choice to at least get the basic setup going. So anyhow, mine's fine. I'm going to click on continue and we'll wait for this to go through. Next up, it's going to ask you to set a host name. You can always leave it as the one that is currently displayed. In this case, this is actually the last name that this machine had when I installed Linux Mint. I'm going to name this something different. I'm just going to call it Kali 2025. But of course, you can feel free to name the machine whatever you want. I'm going to click on continue. If you have a domain that is connecting to, you can put in the information here. For 99% of you, you will most likely just leave this as is. So I'll click on continue as I'm not joining a domain. And then it's going to ask you to set up a users and passwords. So type in the full name of your user, aka you, or whatever name you want to assign as the user. I'm just going to call mine digital, name it whatever you like, click on continue. And then it's going to ask you for a username account. I'm just going to leave it as digital, click on continue. And then it's going to ask you to set a password. And of course, the big thing that it mentions is make sure to select a strong password that can't be guessed. And it also gives you the option to show the password in clear if you want to make sure that you are typing it properly. In my case, I'm just going to set a basic password. However, I recommend setting a very strong password. So we'll click on continue, and then it's going to ask you about your time zone. So select the time zone that you are in. Eastern is fine with me. I'm going to click on continue. Now it's going to detect the hard drives and all that good stuff. Now for the sake of this video, I'm going to outright nuke everything on the machine, including the operating system that is currently on it. If you wanted to set up a dual boot machine, then you could go through that process. But like I said, for the sake of this video, the machine's only operating system is going to be Kali Linux. So I'm going to continue on as if that is the only operating system. So I'm going to select guided use entire disk, click on continue, and then select the hard drive of the machine. One thing you'll notice here is that the thumb drive also shows up. So make sure you select your actual internal hard drive and not the thumb drive. So I'm going to select the Samsung NVMe drive that is in it. Click on continue. You do have a number of options here. I'm going to leave it as the recommended state. However, if you wanted to research to figure out if any of these are to your liking, then feel free to choose that. However, most people are just going to select the recommended option. So we'll click on continue. Now at this point, it's basically going to ask us if it's okay to go ahead and nuke all of the data on the machine. So if at this point you have any data on the machine that you actually need, then you can go ahead and just shut the machine down, fire it back up the data that you need, and then continue on with this process. So in my case, there is no data that I need, so I'm going to continue on. So we're going to leave this as finished partitioning and write changes to disk. Click on continue. And then here it's warning us that ultimately we are going to nuke the data. So I'm just going to select yes, because I'm perfectly fine with that. Click on continue. And at this point, just give it some time as it starts installing everything that we need. And we will continue on when it is ready for us. Now it's going to give us a few options that we can choose from. So for one, we have the desktop environment is checked, which as it mentions here, selecting this item has no effect. However, by default, the XFCE, Kali's default desktop environment is set. If you don't want XFCE for the desktop environment, you could choose GNOME, or you could also choose KDE Plasma. So I recommend you look at these first and figure out which ones you want to go with. However, for the sake of this video, I'm going to leave it as the XFCE, as it is Kali's default desktop environment. And then there's the collection of tools. Selecting this item has no effect, but there is the top 10, and that is the top 10 most popular tools. And then there's the default option of recommended tools. And I'm just going to leave these all as is. However, if you wanted to decrease the amount of stuff that is on it, then you could feel free to uncheck these. And worst case, you can always load the stuff in after the fact. However, for the sake of this video, leaving everything as is, we'll click on continue. And once again, just be patient as the magic unfolds here. All right, if all went well, we should see finish the installation and installation complete. It basically mentions to make sure to pull the thumb drive to make sure that the machine actually boots to your internal hard drive instead of the thumb drive again. My way of doing this is that I'm going to click on continue, and then once the machine starts shutting down and we get back to the manufacturer's logo screen, aka the post screen, I generally, right before that, I try to pull the thumb drive, so then everything will just boot fresh from the internal drive. So I'm going to click on continue, and then any moment now it should finish, and we'll give it just a moment, and I'll pull it now. So now it should hopefully boot from the internal drive if everything was actually happy. And this is good, and it's got the few seconds to actually select something else on that screen. However, I'm just going to leave that be, so it just boots what we need. And then at this point, we should hopefully see the login screen. So I'm going to log in here with the username and password that I set, and I'll hit enter, and now we are in. One thing I'm going to do real quick is just optimize my display settings, and that's because traditionally on a machine that you would install Kali Linux on, it would automatically set the resolution to the proper native resolution. However, my capture device, it doesn't understand what the native resolution is. So real quick, I'm going to click on the Kali icon over here. I'm going to just select settings. I'm going to go into settings, and then I'm going to go to display, and then I'm just going to change the resolution to the proper resolution for my machine, and I'll click on apply and keep this configuration and close. All right, so this should look a lot crisper now. So let me do just a general tour of Kali Linux. I'm not going to go through everything because there's so many different applications that are going to be on here, but I'm going to go through just the basics of kind of what you're going to find, and it should kind of give you breadcrumbs into looking further into the operating system and stuff like that. So let's begin. So beginning in the top right corner, so this is technically the power button or power options button up here. If we click on this, then it's going to give us a number of options. For instance, log out, restart, shut down, switch user, hybrid sleep, hibernate, and suspend. I'm going to click cancel for this, but that is how you can do those options. And then there's the lock button, which would lock the machine. And then you would just log back in and just hit enter, which will click the unlock button. And then to the left of that is going to be your time and calendar options. So if you actually click on this, it will open up a small calendar, which will show you the month that you're in. And you can also feel free to toggle between things, toggle between months and years and all that good stuff. To the left of that is the power manager section. There's a presentation mode that you can turn on, and then there's also a settings option, which allows you to change up a number of things. So there's a general section, the system section with a number of settings, and then there's also the display section where you can change up the display options for when the screen goes to sleep and all that good stuff. And there's also the screensaver management section down here, which gives you a number of things. So for instance, screensaver themes, and then there's also a lock screen that you can adjust a number of options on. We'll click close for that and close out of that. And then to the left of that is going to be the bell icon, which is basically your notifications area. So if there were any pending notifications, then they would show up here. However, in this case, there are no notifications. And then there is also the option to clear the log. There's a do not disturb option. You can mark all as read, and there's also a notifications settings section that you can adjust all sorts of stuff. There's a general section, appearance, applications, and log. So this keeps a log of your notifications in there, but we'll click close for that. And then next up is going to be the volume options, or the sound options, I guess I should say. So the top portion is going to be the actual sound volume. You can also turn it off and you can turn it back on. And the same goes for the microphone down here. You can change up the mic volume, and you can also toggle it off and toggle it back on. And then there's also a number of different options here, including an audio mixer, which gives you a whole bunch of options. There's even an advanced section in here. So you got playback options, recording, output devices, input devices, and then there's also a configurations section here, which had the little arrow to it. So you'll notice every now and then you may see arrows showing other options, or you can expand it out and it will show you all the options without having the little arrow. So we'll click out of that. And then to the left of that is going to be your network options. So if you had a hardwired connection, then you would see it here under the Ethernet network, and then there's the Wi-Fi network section. Now, if you needed to connect to wireless, then usually there's the available networks option, and then it will show you all the SSIDs that are within range, and you can choose whichever one you want here. For the sake of this video, this is going to be mostly blurred out because my neighbors are showing up in here. And then there's connect to hidden Wi-Fi networks, create new Wi-Fi network, and then VPN connections. And you can add a VPN connection. And you may have noticed that there's all these little kind of lights or whatnot showing up here. And this is basically your task manager. So if you were to left click this, then here's the task manager for Kali Linux. So you can take a look at stuff here. You can see what your CPU utilization is and the memory utilization. You can search for processes up here. And then you can also select a settings section, which can have all sorts of good stuff that you can add or remove. And then there's also a column section that you can add and remove stuff. So we'll close out of that and we can exit out of Task Manager. And next up, let's go to the furthest left top corner. And that is the Kali icon, kind of like the start menu, I guess you could say. And I previously went into here just to kind of get into the screen settings and whatnot. However, going in here now, there's a search feature. So if you want to search for an application like terminal or anything else you want to type in here to search for an application that might be on here, there's a recently used section. So in this case, because I went to the display settings, it's showing that. There's all applications, which of course is going to show you everything that is on here for all the applications and what have you. So as you can see, there is a lot of stuff in here. Lots of tools and all that good stuff. And then there's the settings, which is going to then open up all the different setting options that you have in here. There's a usual applications section, which breaks down. If you click on another one, then you can take a look at more options. So you can keep breaking them out depending on what you want. And then there's also subsections in here, for instance, information gathering, vulnerability analysis, web application analysis, database assessment, password attacks, wireless attacks, reverse engineering, exploitation tools, sniffing and spoofing, post-exploitation, forensics, reporting tools, social engineering tools, Kali and OffSec links. So there is just a phenomenal amount of tools right out of the box on this operating system. And then if you also notice down here is your username that you're logged in as. There's a settings manager button down here. And then there's also a logout button. Now, before I dig into anything else like settings and whatnot, which I'll just give a brief overview of things, but I just want to keep showing off kind of what we have on the default desktop here. So there's a minimize all open windows and show the desktop. So for instance, if I had something open, I can click on this and it will make it disappear so that we see just the desktop. But if you click it again, then whatever you had open will pop back up again. To the right of that is going to be your general file directory options. So there's open folder, you can open a terminal, you can create a folder, create a text document, and then there's also a number of things such as your desktop, and it's got subcategories within here, documents, downloads, music, pictures, public, templates, and videos. So there's a lot of stuff you can choose in there. To the right of that is your basic text editor. So this is more in line with something like Notepad, but also more like Notepad++, as it has a whole bunch more options than the generic Notepad would have in Windows. And then to the right of that is going to be Firefox, which is the default browser in Kali Linux. And it also comes with a number of favorites or bookmarks already attached to the top here that you can take a peek at. And if you wanted to maximize it, it's slightly hidden, but if you hover over here, you can click the maximize button. And there's also the minimize button right to the left of that. And anything that you do have open is going to show up in this bar up top here. But anyhow, we can close out of Firefox. And then the next thing that's over is going to be your terminal emulator. So if you click on that, it's going to come up with the terminal. But if we close out of this and click this little drop down, then there's also the root terminal emulator and then PowerShell. So if you're familiar with PowerShell, then there's a number of things you can do with that. And then also just to show on the desktop is going to be your home directory, which is what I opened up real quickly to show off the hide apps option there. But this is going to give you your places, and this is going to have computer. So here is everything for hard drives and whatnot on this machine, along with the file system. And then there's the account, the desktop, recent, trash, and you can of course empty trash. And then there's a whole bunch of other options in here. So a lot of stuff to peruse. And then there's also the file, edit, view, go, bookmarks, and help section that you can take a look at, but we'll close out of that. And then there's file system, which brings us basically to the absolute root of the drive, of your hard drive, to take a look at different folders and file directories and all that good stuff that you can dig into if need be. And then of course is your trash. So if anything is in here, then you could empty the trash, or you can also restore selected items. So we'll close out of that. And then there's also this numbering scheme up at the top, and this is basically desktops. So if you wanted multiple desktops to be open and potentially multiple applications open on those desktops, then you can open something, jump to another desktop, which would be empty. You can open another app kind of thing, and you can kind of just keep jumping between your desktops that you have there. So let's go back to the Kali start menu, as I'll call it. And let's take a look at the settings manager down here. And then let's maximize this. Now, like I said, I'm not going to show off everything in here, but I just want to show off some kind of key areas that people may want to go into. One of them is under the personal section is the appearance section. So there's a number of defaults, and then you can also add ones if you wanted to. There's an icons section to where you can change up what the icons would look like. There's fonts. And then there's settings to take a peek at. So we'll click on all settings to go back. If you have Bluetooth and you want to connect any sort of Bluetooth devices, there's the Bluetooth manager. However, in my case, I would click this, but I don't actually have a Bluetooth controller on my machine to actually make this work. But basically, that's where you can go in and you can add in Bluetooth devices and what have you. And then as I'd shown off earlier, there's the display section where you can change up your resolution, refresh rate, and your scale and whatnot. But there's also an advanced section where you can set profiles if need be, and then there's a number of options down below. So I just want to show that. We'll click on all settings again, and then there's the print settings. If you need to add a printer, then you can do so here. And that's basically it for the general overview of things. You know, feel free to take a peek at the settings section here if you want to adjust anything else. But for right now, we'll click on close. One thing I just want to show real quick is how to keep Kali Linux up to date. So if we go to the terminal up here, and let me maximize this. And then if we type in sudo space apt space update, or sudo apt update, and hit enter, you'll ask us for a password. We'll type that in, hit enter, and then it mentions that 570 packages can be upgraded. But let's go ahead and run a sudo space apt space upgrade. Let's type -y, and this is just going to accept any upgrades that are needed. Hit enter, and then just let this roll and upgrade everything that needs to be updated. It's going to be fetching and installing all the applications that need updates. So not only is this great for keeping the machine up to date for security purposes, but it's also making it so that it has bug fixes and also potentially new features and stuff like that. And it looks like everything just completed. So my recommendation is to maybe once a week or so manually kick those commands off to make sure that everything is staying up to date for, like I said, security purposes and also bug fixes, performance improvements, stuff like that. So we can go ahead and close out of that now. And then one last thing just to show off is that if you right click on the desktop, there's a number of options that you can choose from. For instance, create launcher, create a UR link, create folder, create a document, open terminal here, open as root, open a new window, arrange desktop icons. There's desktop settings and applications. Desktop settings gives you the option if you want to change your desktop background, which you can feel free to change things up however you want. There's a menu icon, desktop icons, file launcher icons, and keyboard shortcuts that you can take a peek at, but we can go ahead and close out of that. So that's all you need to do to get Kali Linux 2025 installed on a machine. If you found this video to be useful, please like it and subscribe to my channel to keep up with the latest video happenings. I also invite you to check out my channel if you haven't already, as it has many interesting guides and many more to come. Anyhow, until next time, take it easy.